as a leaf dies, not only does it wither physically through its shape, but it also goes through a color transition, a green to yellow to orange to red to brown phase. And we can start that transition in the middle of the leaf or randomly at positions throughout the leaf. Again, this will depend on the type of foliage you're creating. In order to create the effect, we're not going to use the ice tree, but we're going to use the render tree and create a shader compound to house this effect, at which point we can offload it and use it in any other scene that requires this type of animation. So I don't really need the point cloud here. This is just going to kind of slow me down a little bit. So I can actually see the transformation of the leaf here as it sort of dies. So it sort of flows in the wind, and that could be fixed as well too. But if I open up the render tree, I'll go to the materials manager. So I'm looking at the leaf material. I'll just maybe make this a little smaller and open out the preset manager. I'm going to blend the texture map of the leaf with a procedural shader. And for this, I'm going to use the spatial texture shaders. So I'm not actually going to use the texture shaders that are the 2D shaders. I'm going to use the 3D version of these same procedurals found down lower in the texture generators category of XSI. So texture generators are 3D procedural textures where you can control many more attributes of the shader. You can warp the shader using some of the texture space controllers, such as the 3D warp, or do a lot of reflective mirroring with the kaleidoscopic texture space controller. So the benefit of using these generators as opposed to the traditional texture shaders is that these are clamped to the UVs that you create, whereas the texture space generators and accompanying procedural shaders can be modulated. The UV space can be modulated with these texture space nodes here. So I'll show you how that works. I'm going to start by pulling in a gradient shader. So we have our procedural gradient, and it doesn't use the traditional UV coordinates that you would expect. If you look at the input for the gradient, we can use a vector input, so we can actually use a set of UVs, or we can use a scalar input, so a single scalar value, or extracting an individual scalar axis from our vector input. I'm going to keep it on a vector input, and I need to, first of all, drive the overall effect into maybe the diffuse channel. So I'll just drop this into the diffuse channel, and right away if I draw a render region, we won't have the leaf texture anymore. It'll be replaced with red, or the first color in our gradient. So we're actually not mapping into the gradient ramp yet. So to use a set of coordinates to drive the gradient, let's go down into the texture space generators, and let's go and pull in our projection that we have assigned that this texture is using. Texture projection lookup, if I double click on it, we can use an existing texture projection, which is in this case this guy here, the one that we already used to unwrap our leaf, and then we'll drive the gradient's coordinates that way. So in this sense, you can use texture repeats, or you can start to control the shader through the render tree with a little bit more precision. So if I go into the 2D gradient, I'll double click on it, I don't want a vertical gradient type. I'm going to have an expanding radial gradient, so you get the traditional bullseye. If I just draw another render region here, and I'm going to remove some of these. I'm going to go through perhaps a 4 or 5 color shift. So I'll start off just by going with a black to white gradient, and the center, or the outermost portion of the leaf anyways, will start off with a green color. So I'll just kind of pick a green to start with, and I'll add a slow transition here. So this will eventually transition to yellow as we get closer to the middle of the leaf, but for now I'll keep them all as variations. And actually, maybe I can get away with 3, because transitioning from green to yellow to orange to red, to get to red you're going to go through a yellow orange as well. So I'll actually just keep it to 3 for now to make this simpler. You can always expand upon these ideas, of course. So I'll set all 3 color channels here to a variation of green. So this is representative of the leaf in full season. Okay, it's summer. The leaves are at they're kind of greenest. So this is where we're going to start the season. and we're going to transition into a dead gray leaf, of course as driven by the fold operator. So the first part of our problem is solved. Again, I can easily mix this 2D gradient back with my original texture if I go and use a mixer node and I use a mix two colors. If I drag in a mix two colors, I can use the original color of the leaf so I can extract some of the texture. And if I replace the diffuse connection, so we're back to our original leaf mixed with, if I grab the mix two colors node, mixed with blue, blended at 50%, in this second color, color 1 input of the mix two colors shader, I'll take the 2D gradient output and use it to drive color 1. And then of course we can specify our mix. So if I use 100% of color 1, I'm going to get all of my 2D gradient, and if I use 0% or 100% of the base color, I get my leaf. So find a balance somewhere in the middle so I can actually see the texture of the leaf. Let me just raise the aliasing a little. And perhaps change the blending mode. So if I was to screen, I get a bit of a brighter color here. So I'm actually taking a lot more of the texture with the underlying layer and screening a green color over top of it. I can even amplify the green channel a little more by removing some of the red and blue. Okay, so I don't mind that. That is actually looking pretty good for my starting point. So we've got the first part of our render tree built. 2D gradient blended back in with our original texture map. Now for the remainder of this build, I'm simply going to hook the 2D gradient directly into the diffuse so I can clearly see this effect before I blend it back in for the final effect.